What's happening in Pokrovsk? Is the Russian army already in the city center? There it is! And here is the disposal of those very Russian conscripts in the SU Deyudzaru. The collapse of Russian aviation, laser weapons, and the A-60 aircraft have been destroyed. This was possibly the only unit which was being prepared to replace the long-range radar detection aircraft, a 50. Putin's soldiers are fleeing the battlefield and deserting. I'm going to turn everything off remotely right now. All of Russia is burning. In Cheboksary, a strike hit a military factory. Fire. $5 billion worth of weapons. Ukraine is getting stronger. There will be even more explosions in Russia. And Trump is still demanding that Kyiv give up territory.
This land could be captured by Russia in the next few months anyway.
What's happening in Pokrovsk? There is footage showing that the Russians have apparently broken through to the city center, and DeepState is reporting on this. On the other hand, the Ukrainian Armed Forces are eliminating Russians on an industrial scale in this city. In a minute, I'll show you the footage and we'll discuss it with a military expert. In addition, another strike was carried out on Russian aviation, and this time it wasn't just a laser one, but in Taganrog, the Ukrainian Armed Forces destroyed a rather experienced A-100LL aircraft. And of course, we'll show you how Russia's military factories are burning. This time, there was a spectacular fire in Cheboksary. All the details are coming up soon, so stay tuned for the discussion with the expert. It's going to be interesting.
Key military and energy facilities in Russia are under attack. In just one strike, the Russians lost an aircraft repair plant, a drone manufacturing enterprise, an oil terminal, a refinery, an S-400 air defense system installation, and the cherry on top, an experimental A-60 laser aircraft, which Russia will no longer be able to recreate. This glow was witnessed by the residents of Taganrog. It was extremely hot there on Monday night, especially in the area of the Beriev aircraft repair plant. The enterprise specializes in the development, serial production, modernization, and repair of amphibious aircraft and special-purpose aviation complexes, in particular the A-50 long-range radar detection and control aircraft. The aircraft plant also carries out major overhauls of Russian aviation aircraft and upgrades strategic Tu-95 MSM missile-carrying bombers. Next to the enterprise is the main test base of this plant, the Taganrog Yuzhny military airfield. Rare units of Russian aviation equipment are stored at this location.
Yes, an airplane.
More precisely, rare units of Russian aviation equipment used to be stored here. At the airbase, an A-60 aircraft, also known as the Flying Laboratory, was hit. This aircraft was intended for testing laser weapons. It is a Soviet development. The project was developed in the 1970s. As part of the USSR's strategy to create anti-satellite laser weapons, the aircraft is distinguished by a distinctive hump. It is precisely in this hump that a 1-megawatt laser installation is located. The idea was that this laser could either jam the optical devices of enemy satellites or even damage their sensors and other equipment. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the project was put on hold, but the Russians resurrected it and spent years trying to bring it back to life. At the same time, they never missed a chance to threaten the world with their unparalleled weaponry.
Soon, the Russian army will be armed with a weapon straight out of Star Wars, capable of incinerating enemies both on the ground and in the air.
The Soviets developed only 2 such aircraft, so the destruction of one is not just a painful blow to Putin's ambitions, but a devastating one. The Russians will no longer be able to recreate their flying laboratory. And the Z-Patriots know this as well.
Protective shelters, relocation, never heard of such things. It will soon be 4 years since the start of the special military operation. Idiotic internet shutdowns didn't help either against enemy UAVs, which are controlled in part by satellite communication systems, or against local residents filming footage of the strikes. Probably an effective measure would have been to relocate the aircraft from a region that is under enemy UAV attacks almost every day.
But the fact that these were drone strikes is by no means certain. The Ukrainian General Staff stated that they used Baz drones and Neptune cruise missiles to strike Russian strategic targets.
Neptune both, it's definitely approaching now.
It hit the building, right? That was a real blast. Damn, seriously?
During the strike on Taganrog, the Molnia UAV manufacturing facility by Land Aero was also hit. Fires have been reported at the site, according to the military. But it wasn't just Taganrog. Explosions were also widely heard in the Krasnodar region. The strikes targeted the Cheboksary oil terminal in Novorossiysk and the Tuapse oil refinery. In Novorossiysk, oil tankers and one of the S-400 air defense system launchers were damaged, according to the General Staff. The extent of the damage is being clarified.
Jan Matviv, a military expert, is joining our broadcast. Jan, good evening. We're glad to see you. Let's start with Pokrovsk. Please tell us what's actually happening there, because we see footage that appears to show Russian forces. This is being reported by DeepState. According to their information, they are in the city center. Please tell us, does this mean that, unfortunately, the occupation of Pokrovsk is in its final stage? Or how do you see it?
Yes, good evening. Actually, the latest events, the most recent information that has come out over the past few days has helped to determine both the area under Russian control and the area that can be considered a gray zone. Everything south and southwest of the railway can generally be considered more or less under the control of the Russian army. That is, in some places it's full control, in others it's less so, but nevertheless, Ukrainian forces also carry out raids there from time to time. These are not full-scale counteroffensives. They don't stay there or hold any territory, but nonetheless, they are able to get in there. And this tells us, first and foremost, that everything north of this railway is that very gray zone, where there is no full Ukrainian control, but also no full Russian control. And yes, Russian infantry units are advancing much further north and much further west. They are already being encountered on the approaches to Hryshin, as well as on the approaches to the villages of Rovna and Svetle. These are two villages located between Pokrovsk and Hryshin. And Mirnohrad is quite an important place, because if the Russian army manages to gain a foothold there, it will partially lead to, well, it will be a major step toward fully attempting to encircle Mirnohrad, and accordingly this would cut off the entire remaining part of the Pokrovsk salient if there are still any Ukrainian troops left there, which is not certain. In fact, it feels like they've only the northern main part remains under control, specifically Mirnohrad. And toward Rodinsky as well, Russian infantry groups are trying to advance from the direction of Pokrovsk. Well, I mean, trying how? They were spotted in the area between Pokrovsk and Rodinsky, where they were attacked by Ukrainian drones. That is, the footage available indicates that the Russian infantry was unable to gain a foothold there and move around freely. In other words, they were attacked, and most likely the soldiers were killed or wounded and forced to retreat. But it's possible there are some who accordingly went unnoticed, who didn't end up on the drone cameras and are moving around somewhere there. So there is this large gray zone, essentially stretching from Rodinske to somewhere around the northern part of Pokrovsk up to the railway, and it remains in place. And the main difficulty for the Ukrainian armed forces is that it is precisely through this gray zone that their supply lines run. This is the supply for the Ukrainian units, the Ukrainian group that is defending Mirnohrad. The center, essentially the main center of the northern part of Mirnohrad. And there, the defenses are still quite impenetrable for Russian soldiers, despite the fact that they are also trying to break through in small infantry groups. In fact, one such group did try to break through, but as far as I remember, in the end, some soldiers were taken prisoner there. And right now, the Russian army is mainly bombing the center of Mirnohrad simply to prevent Ukrainian soldiers from being able to defend themselves properly and stay there. Because they simply can't take this place by storm. But there is a risk that these fighters will be cut off because their supply zone, their supply routes already pass through the gray zone. Today, there are no Russian troops there, but tomorrow, who knows, maybe they'll break through and establish a foothold somewhere, and then it will be completely impossible to get through, even though right now, obviously, it's already extremely difficult to do so because of drones. And this is probably the main threat right now. the threat to the logistics of Mirnograd at the moment, because the Ukrainian armed forces have not yet been able to fully take Rodinsky with all its outskirts, and thus open up a corridor to Mirnograd.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
I want to ask you about a certain military political aspect, because Trump has mentioned several times that the Russians will soon capture the entire Donetsk region anyway, seemingly without having any real understanding of the maps of this area. Nevertheless, this surprises no one. And here, the Ukrainian General Staff says that the enemy won't even be able to fully capture Pokrovsk before the new year. What do you think about any forecasts regarding further advances by the Russian army? Because right now, everything comes down to Trump allegedly pressuring Ukraine to withdraw from the Donetsk region. You'll lose it anyway. At the same time, so far, judging by the pace, we don't see it. That anything correlates with the words of the American president. What does the situation actually look like in terms of the pace of the advance?
In fact, we can see that the pace of the advance has increased. This is actually typical for every autumn. And let's say last autumn, in terms of the pace of the Russian advance, was more difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces than this autumn, if you just look at it mathematically, in terms of square kilometers. And of course, the pace that the Russian army is demonstrating now, even if we take the sum of all the captured territories, not only in the Donetsk region, but also in Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and naturally Kharkiv region, and in Sumy, they're not capturing anything anymore. Even with such overall rates of advance, these would not allow the Russian army, if suddenly all these rates, all of this captured territory would not be spread out along the entire front, but would suddenly be concentrated specifically in the Donetsk region. Even that would not allow, in just a few months, as Trump claims, to capture the Donetsk region. It's more accurate to talk about a year or more. And that's not even taking into account the potentially very prolonged resistance of the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. Even in the event that it is blockaded, let's say there's a semicircle around it, and so on. It's a situation, let's say, similar to Pokrovsk, because Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and all the surrounding area are much larger than Pokrovsk, and it would take much longer to storm all of that. We saw clearly how the Russian army tried to capture Pokrovsk, well, using a new tactic, so to speak. And that's how they managed to take Vuhledar, meaning without a direct assault on the city. But with Pokrovsk, it didn't work out. They tried, ran into the Ukrainian Armed Forces defenses, and had to storm it head on. They had to send infantry into these endless, basically, yes, small local assaults, you could say. This constant infiltration, of course, comes with heavy losses. In fact, yes, this is a kind of modern version of a frontal assault, you could put it that way. And accordingly, if the same thing happens in Sloviansk-Kramatorsk, then just the assaults on these cities alone could take a year, maybe two. For the Russian army, it would be just their gradual capture. Because, for example, you don't have to look only at Pokrovsk. Take Toretsk, for instance. The Russian army took a very long time to capture it. I can't say exactly how long, unfortunately, but it was about a year or so. You can check the DeepState map, for example, to see this. Chasiv Yar, for example. Yes, it was declared captured, but in reality, it still hasn't been taken. In fact, Ukrainian forces recently even carried out a small local counterattack there. It's the same story with Kupiansk and with Vovchansk as well. Even though the Russian army is now saying that, well, Kupiansk has already been declared captured, although that's not true. And with Vovchansk, they keep adding percentages to their claimed control. But it's the same situation as with Kupiansk. Still, the duration of the process, the length of the fighting for these cities, I don't know. It seems to be breaking all possible records, because there haven't been such prolonged battles for settlements, not even during World War II, for example. All the great battles that went down in history, the defenses of cities that lasted a long time. But now, in fact, we see the Ukrainian armed forces defending cities even longer and more stubbornly. And that's why saying that Donetsk region will be captured quickly is only possible in cases where the Ukrainian army collapses, meaning it experiences such a severe shortage, primarily of manpower, and such serious destabilizing factors occur. I don't know, maybe some kind of soldier mutinies, complete command failures, total disorganization, loss of supply for some reason. If something like that happens, then of course, at that point, the situation, the terrain, and so on would no longer matter. Then naturally, the Russian army would simply be able to advance. But this was threatened last fall. It was threatened in the spring of this year and in the summer of this year as well. At the beginning of autumn, there was also talk that the Ukrainian armed forces were on their last legs, that everything was about to collapse and the Russian army would just move forward. But no, we see the same pressure as before. Here's an example with Pokrovsk. About a month ago, maybe a little less, Gerasimov said that Pokrovsk was encircled, that 31 Ukrainian battalions were surrounded there, and so on. What we've seen since then is that, yes, the Russian army controls a significant, you could even say the larger part of Pokrovsk, but nevertheless, there is still no complete victory. And the AFU are finding the strength not just to hold on, not just to carry out some local counterattacks. They are even still present in the Pokrovsk salient itself, in fact, holding on to Myronarad. Although when you look at the map, when you read all this, watch the videos, you realize just how risky it is. But since they are taking this risk, it means they believe it's an appropriate measure right now. In other words, this is how they assess their capabilities. And all of this indicates that they have not suffered a critical drop in combat effectiveness. If they had, then they would have pulled out long ago. That is, any remaining forces would need to be preserved and protected. In other words, at the first sign of any threat, everyone would need to be urgently withdrawn. For example, in the Zaporizhzhia region, on the Zaporizhzhia front, there was a local crisis, undoubtedly, which allowed Russian troops to approach Huliai-Pole rather quickly. What will happen next? We'll see. If the Ukrainian armed forces manage to stabilize the defense there, then essentially Russian attacks will slow down. Yes, there are difficult situations on other parts of the front as well. There is already fighting for Siversk, and the Russian army is approaching Lyman. But again, all of this is a gradual advance by the Russian army with heavy losses and constant clashes. These aren't, let's say, breakthroughs where the front is empty and you can go wherever you want, just get in a car and drive forward. You won't encounter the enemy. No. Every time we see that, even if there is some local breakthrough, a local problem, maybe a Ukrainian unit can't cope or even retreats, the integrity of the front is still maintained for now. And you can't deny that. You can't say it's not true. Well, let's at least look at the Sumy region. If the Ukrainian armed forces had really serious problems, if they couldn't defend themselves properly at all, of course, right now it's a secondary direction, meaning the Russian army isn't holding large forces there, and if they wanted, they could become more active. But everything there, for example, is completely blocked off.
All right, there's something else I want to ask you about. After all, the strikes on Taganrog were quite serious, and it's not just about the laser A60. There was also significant damage to the experienced 100A, 100LL aircraft, which was used in Russia as a flying laboratory. According to the media, it was being used to develop a new long-range airborne early warning aircraft, and it was destroyed during the operation. We can also add the effective strike on Cheboksary to this list. That's 1,300 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. A factory producing navigation equipment, which supplies cruise and ballistic missiles, was hit. It was called Veneer Progress in Cheboksary. Could you please tell us what do you think about the intensity of the strikes on Russian military targets? Is the Russian military-industrial complex really starting to feel more pain? Or for now, are these strikes offset by the sheer number of these military enterprises and more?
Well, of course, the Russian military-industrial complex is very large, but what's important here is that there are some very sensitive areas, and specifically the plant in Cheboksary. We don't yet know how seriously it was damaged, but it produces cometa antennas. I'm not much of an expert in radio engineering, but I read up and rely on those who know the field. And this cometa has been mentioned since around 2023, and it's used not only in drones, in Shaheds, I believe, as well, but also, for example, in UMPK systems, the very ones that turn regular aerial bombs into glide bombs, allowing them to fly far and enabling Russian aircraft to launch them from a great distance, safely out of range of air defenses. So this is a very, very important component, and if its production is disrupted, there will be major problems as a result. If you try to fly without it, everything will just get jammed by electronic warfare. And accordingly, to manufacture it, you need production capacity. I don't know how many factories actually produce this cometa, but in any case, any reduction will have an impact. As for the Taganrog plant, yes, this A100 aircraft is a flying laboratory, meaning it's not an aircraft that could be used in combat, although theoretically, I suppose it could be, but it's unlikely. However, the testing, research, and development of all this are currently very important for Russian aviation because this is precisely a new type of aircraft, an airborne early warning and control aircraft, so-called A100. And As we know, in recent times, the Russian army, the Russian aerospace forces, have lost at least 2 such aircraft, and possibly several more have been damaged. One of the aircraft was shot down by a Ukrainian missile, and the second was either also shot down by a missile or by their own, yes, by a missile, but their own, a Russian one, over the Krasnodar region. And accordingly, there were a total of 8 such aircraft. There are 6 left, yes, not counting those that may have been additionally damaged. Accordingly, every such aircraft is extremely, extremely important for the Air Force, and the Russian military really has nowhere else to get them from. And so the development of a new aircraft like this, well, obviously it's still based on the IL-76, but the IL-76 is a good platform. It's a proven aircraft, quite convenient, easy to produce and repair. But it's specifically the internals, the antenna, all the electronics that are all new, and these were very, very much needed by the Russian aerospace forces. So to what extent will work now come to a halt? We don't know. Of course, some Z channels are writing that it's all nonsense, that the aircraft wasn't needed at all. But what else can they say, right?
Well, obviously, let's hope that these losses will be significant for the Russian army. What else is there to say? Thank you very much. Jan Matviv, military analyst, was on the air with Ukraine Today. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.